You know, occasionally, good philosophers who have produced compelling analyses and have advanced our understanding of profound problems, the train of their argument sometimes goes careening off the rails. That is, it doesn't merely take a side spur, it becomes airborne. And there's a certain fascination, I think, in watching a catastrophe in the making. 2 years ago, Jerry Fodor, a prominent and accomplished philosopher, along with a co-author, wrote a little book, What Darwin Got Wrong. Fodor claimed that natural selection, as contemporary neo-Darwinian biologists use it, has no explanatory power because it assumes that nature acts for intentions. Now, there is, in fact, a story to be told about nature acting for intentions, but Fodor neglected to tell it. Instead, he displayed, I think, a singular obtuseness about contemporary biology. Thomas Nagel, in a recent book, would appear to offer a comparable spectacle. His book entitled Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialistic Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Several years ago, Nagel published what became a famous essay entitled, What is it like to be a bat? And the thesis of the essay was this: you can know the neurophysiology of an organism, say a bat, but you really can't, I mean, you can know everything about it, but you still would be missing something, namely what it's like to be a bat, what bat consciousness would be like. And so for the same thing for us, it would appear that we could know everything there is to know about the neurophysiology, say, of a particular human being, but you couldn't know what it was like to be that being. You couldn't have access to consciousness. Mind and brain seem to be really quite disparate entities. You can have, for example, the experience of a red plane or a green book, but it seems like red and green are so totally different from any neuroparticulate physiology that one could investigate. The features of consciousness just, again, seem to be so totally different. So in his recent book, what Nagel suggests is because Darwinian evolutionary theory doesn't seem to be able to explain this, it must be certainly false, at least in its details. Like Fodor, Nagel hardly displays, I think, an intimate knowledge of evolutionary theory, or, for that matter, even contemporary science. Because of his acuteness, however, in talking about human cognition, Nagel's arguments do merit, I think, some considered response, since they echo hesitations coming from a source that was right at the heart of Darwinian evolutionary theory. Neither Fodor nor Nagel has religious motives for their critiques, though Nagel, despite his protestations of atheism, does have sympathy for the arguments stemming from the intelligent design crowd. And perhaps not surprisingly, they have embraced this brother from a foreign planet. Nagel's concern is perhaps not surprising. Consciousness and morality do seem definitive of the human animal. Yet they also seem really apparently impervious to a Darwinian analysis. Well, the difficulties are long-standing, and in this talk what I'd like to do is get at them a bit indirectly by initially investigating the objections of two other critics who really can't be, I think, interpreted as being hostile to evolutionary theory, nor ignorant of biology. These individuals are Alfred Russel Wallace and Thomas Henry Huxley. Wallace, the co-founder of evolution by natural selection along with Darwin, and Huxley, Darwin's great defender. In the face of Darwin's accomplishment, these individuals seemed at certain points in their development to suggest that when skies are hung and oceans drowned, the single secret will still be man. On June 18, 1858, while laboring over a massive treatise that was going to be called natural selection. Darwin got a letter from a fairly obscure naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace. He had been in correspondence with Wallace for a little bit prior to receiving this letter. Wallace was then on a collecting trip in Malaya. Wallace came from a family much lower in the socioeconomic strata than Darwin, and he had to earn his keep by supplying museums with interesting biological specimens. Darwin, when he read the letter and the essay that was enclosed in the letter, he was in immediate and profound despair. He said it was as if Wallace were standing behind him and looking over his shoulder and reading out of his notebooks. So close was the theory that Wallace was proposing to account for the origin of species that Darwin simply thought that now all his originality had evanesced, and honor required him to toss this manuscript, which had grown really quite large. In fact, if it were published in the way that Darwin was developing it, it would have gone to perhaps 3 very fat volumes. Darwin's friends Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker had to convince him that his originality had not really been lost or compromised, and honor didn't require him to consign his manuscript to the flames. So Darwin condensed the material that he had already written, and he added the chapters that were yet planned, and the abstract, as Darwin himself called it, was published in 1859 in November as On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. After Wallace returned to England in 1862, he and Darwin met and their friendship became sealed. That friendship continued right to the end of Darwin's life in 1882. Wallace, the younger man, he was Darwin's junior by 14 years, would be quite long-lived. He died in 1913 and at age 90, and he was productive right up to the very end. In his later years, Wallace, always the radical thinker, joined the Fabian Socialist and became a staunch feminist. He supported women's suffrage, and he argued for women's economic independence. In a book published in the year of his death, 1913, Wallace contended that if middle-class women were allowed to join the workforce and become economically independent, they would choose mates for the right reason. They would choose more intelligent individuals, more virtuous individuals. But as it was at the time, he thought that they were often forced to choose for economic reasons, not the best of reasons. And should they be able to be emancipated from, as it were, financial slavery, they would choose men for the right reason, and they would produce offspring that would indeed improve the genetic stock of humanity, at least English humanity. In 1864, Wallace presented a paper before the Anthropological Society in London that gave joy to Darwin's heart. He there again anticipated a kind of argument that Darwin would make a little bit later in 1871 in The Descent of Man. The argument was concerning human evolution, and he published this lecture that he gave to the Anthropological Society prior to Darwin's own publishing on human evolution. In that lecture, he argued that at a certain stage in our ancestors' development, when we were still at the pre-human stage, that natural selection began to shift away from man's external body and onto his mind or onto his brain. That is to say, as proto-humans, for example, began to make primitive tools to make their way through the environment in which they lived, when they began to put together skins to wear as clothing and to keep warm, no longer was it required, as in our anthropoid cousins, the apes, that they have the kind of fur that probably at one time they had. But natural selection would move to work on human brain. And human beings living in small tribal groups, small clans, would come together. They would cooperate with one another. They would aid each other mutually. That is, they would be forming, our proto-human ancestors, a small society, a tribal society. And that natural selection would give the advantage to those tribal groups that had more cooperative members, more mutually supportive members, those who evinced the social and communal virtues. And so natural selection would be shifted from the individual on to the group. And this would allow the development of moral character, because if what we mean by morality, and what certainly Wallace meant by morality, was acting for the benefit of another at cost to self. That's what altruism is all about, acting for the benefit of another. But if that were the case, that kind of trait can't be selected for, because after all, what natural selection does is act on an individual that has traits that are beneficial to the individual. So moral traits seem not to be beneficial to the individual, but they will be beneficial to the group. And that's what Wallace considered, that natural selection would work on that. And that was basically what Darwin was going to assert later on in The Descent of Man. So he had anticipated what Darwin was going to say in The Descent of Man. Wallace, however, after this brilliant start, and he and Darwin became great friends, stumbled. In 1865, a year after the Anthropological Society meeting, probably at the urging of his sister Fanny, Wallace began attending seances and started reading published accounts of spiritualistic phenomena. He was particularly impressed by the testimonies concerning the Fox sisters in upstate New York, two famous communers with the spirit world. The next year, in 1866, Wallace hired a medium that his sister had previously engaged, a Miss Agnes Nichol, who later married another spiritualist with the provocative name of Guppy. Miss Nichol her performance around the seance table was truly convincing for Wallace. On one occasion, for example, as the lights were doused and hands held around the table, there was the typical rapping that accompanied these seances. And when the lights were thrown back on, Miss Nichol, a rather rotund woman, seemed to have floated up to the table like a hot air balloon and was seated in the middle of the table. She also had the ability to produce flowers in the midwinter, wet with morning dew, and Wallace even kept one of those bouquets and dried it. So he was convinced that there was a spirit world. And he said that this here, in fact, is a spirit picture, something typical of the time. There would be a photographer usually accompanying the medium, and a sitter, Wallace in this case, would have his picture taken. But if the environment were right and the spirits were cooperating, when the picture was developed, you would see an ectoplasmic appearance. All of this, as I say, convinced Wallace. And this led him to this kind of re-evaluation of the evolutionary argument that he had been giving for, say, human evolutionary development and man's moral character. Wallace pointed out that human beings, particularly in aboriginal human beings, have a brain that is in excess of what is needed for sheer survival. That is, they have a kind of mentality that seems in preparation for something that's going to occur later, that is, development and civilization. But natural selection operates on those traits that are immediately useful, and this excess brain power seemed to be not useful at all. So how to explain it? Well, Wallace's explanation was this, that we are like domestic animals. And just as the breeder selects certain animals because of traits that the breeder likes, so also higher spiritual powers have selected us to have big brains, to have moral character, to have naked skin. That's one of the features of human existence that seems like an aesthetic feature, and Wallace thought that it really doesn't contribute to survival, certainly, naked skin. Therefore, it must be the result of the delectations of these higher spiritual powers. They would just like to see us with such skin. Well, that's where Wallace left. When Darwin, he left off the argument. When Darwin heard of Wallace's new faith, he was devastated. He said, he wrote him a letter saying, "You have killed too completely your and my child." But this led him to reevaluate the whole evolutionary argument. Wallace lost faith at this point. Well, you might have some questions that, about this little bit of evolutionary history, where someone who is deeply committed to the evolutionary perspective, nonetheless, because of the experiences of spiritualism, began to reevaluate the science that he had, in fact, created. So, do you have questions?
He passed away in 1913.
Yeah.
Did he ever meet Harry Houdini?
Great question. No, he never met Houdini. He certainly lost face with other scientists of the period. Darwin himself attended a couple seances, but he was always, he said, he was always disappointed because the chairs didn't start flying until he went upstairs, bored with the whole thing. So the spirits never talked to Darwin. But there were some rather famous scientists who went over to that side. Physicists seem to be particularly liable to be convinced by the spirit world. There was a fellow, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I forget his name now, somebody whom the great Randy, also a magician, exposed as being a fraud. But he convinced 5 physicists at Stanford that there was really something to what he was doing. You got it, Uri Geller. He was the guy. Doyle was another guy who was convinced, a guy by the name of Croke, who was a physicist, 19th century physicist. There were several people who became convinced by these events. And, you know, in a certain way, I suspect if you held a few seances around Cleveland here, you would get people who would be completely convinced. And one has to admit that the mediums were pretty clever.
Could you share with us a little bit of the context of Wallace's experience with Aboriginal peoples?
Yes. So Wallace spent, for about 10 years, he had been in Malaya, Borneo, the Dutch East Indies. He was quite familiar with native peoples. And on the one hand, he certainly regarded them as it were, well, how to say it, aboriginal. They were a lower race. But nonetheless, they evinced, for example, a native mother, evinced all the care and solicitude for her child that a Western mother would evince. It was true that native warfare was pretty brutal, but nonetheless, they were clever, strategic. So he had a great admiration for the intellectual abilities of native peoples. But he decided that when he got back and had undergone this kind of spiritualistic cleansing, he was convinced that they too had excess capacity, brain capacity, for what they needed to do, how they needed to survive in the environment that they were in. And therefore, one couldn't really give it an evolutionary account because, again, evolution can only work on those traits, that is, natural selection can, that are immediately useful in a particular environment. But he was quite sympathetic to native groups. And probably his own socioeconomic situation led to that, because he was not like Darwin. Darwin was an upper middle class member of the gentry and well off financially. Wallace had to work for most of his life. Well, let me turn to another individual who had something of a similar experience that turned him away, momentarily at least, from evolutionary theory. And for reasons that people like Thomas Nagel, the man who I referred to initially, the philosopher, he would have appreciated Huxley's reasons for momentarily, at least, turning away from evolutionary theory. Huxley, as I think most of you know, was Darwin's great defender and protector. But in 1893, he gave a lecture in which he rejected the linchpin of the evolutionary framework, namely the account that that was offered of the evolution of moral conscience, which Darwin certainly thought was a distinctive trait of human beings. And indeed, Darwin, in The Descent of Man, argued that if he really couldn't explain moral conscience, that would allow an avenue for the recently departed divinity to come back into the picture. Well, Huxley had been a longtime friend of Herbert Spencer. His relationship with Spencer was as close as one could get to that border house bachelor. On the occasion of the Huxleys moving into a new house, for example, Spencer gave them a wonderfully expensive clock. This is just an indication of the friendship that they had for one another. But in the late 1880s, that friendship suffered a momentary breach. Huxley's beloved daughter, Miriam, she was a woman of some artistic talent, suffered a collapse into mental illness and finally died. And Huxley was absolutely crushed by this. He failed to take comfort in Spencer's view that progress in the social state would lead ultimately to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. There were other complicating factors, but Huxley's great sadness weighed against Spencer's evolutionary optimism. The old lion accepted an invitation in 1893 to give the second Romanes lecture after the inaugural one by Prime Minister William Gladstone the year before. And Huxley chose as his topic the construction of evolutionary morality. In the lecture before a packed auditorium at Oxford, he proclaimed the indifference of nature to human suffering. He wrote, "Grief and evil fall like the rain upon both the just and the unjust. In the state of nature, the biologically fit survive, but not necessarily the morally fit. Civilized men," Huxley urged, "must combat the savagery of the struggle for existence." And to quote him, "Social progress means checking of the cosmic process at every step and the substitution of it for another, which may be called the ethical process, the end of which is not the survival of those who happen to be the fittest in respect of the whole of the conditions which obtain, but of those who are ethically the best." Then, in a conceptual move that anticipated G.E. Moore's later caution against what came to be known as the naturalistic fallacy, Huxley claimed that evolution could provide no moral guidance at all. Cosmic evolution, he conceded, may teach us how the good and the evil tendencies of man have come about, but in itself it's incompetent to furnish any better reason why what we call good is preferable to what we call evil than we had before. That is to say, to give the nub of the argument, evolution may have produced in us instincts, aggressive instincts, for example, as well as pacific instincts, instincts toward altruism. So if you are upset by the fact that I was only an hour and a half late, and you come and you insult me, my first impulse might be to belt you. As coming from Chicago, that's the way we usually handle these kinds of difficulties. But then I might have another impulse, namely to say, well, to be apologetic and submissive. But the question then is, which should I act upon? And what Huxley maintained is that evolution doesn't indicate that. You have to have a norm, a standard, by which you're judging what's appropriate. But evolution seems to be incapable of providing that norm or standard. So we may have evolved to have these impulses, but there's something missing, and it's namely a standard for judging what is right in that particular situation. And to assume that a fact, namely an evolutionary scenario, can provide a value, that's where Huxley thought the where the argument went wrong, and also G.E. Moore, who, as I say, named the fallacy and called it the naturalistic fallacy. Well, I mentioned that Darwin had been working on human evolution in the 1860s in particular. In The Origin of Species, Patricia, I think, has probably given you a quick overview of the origin, but one of the missing elements of the origin was the question of human evolution. Darwin only briefly alluded to the light that might be shown on man's development by reason of the theory that he had developed in The Origin of Species. But he also wanted to avoid talking about human evolution because he knew that would be what all the reviewers hit upon, and that they wouldn't pay attention to the argument. They would be worried about man being derived from monkeys, as it were, so that he left human beings out of The Origin of Species. But of course, the first reviews did nothing but draw out what must be the implications for human beings via Darwin's theory. And the pressure grew on Darwin to talk about human evolution. He had been working in the 1850s on a problem prior to publishing The Origin of Species, a problem that was really crucial to the later solving of the question of the evolution of moral behavior. This was a problem that he hit upon when he was investigating the social insects, ants, bees, and wasps. And he knew that ants, as indicated here, and bees as well, within a hive or a colony of ants, for example, there will be different castes of ants. Ants that display the same species, display different morphological characteristics. So you see here, the big-headed guy is a major worker, and the smaller one just above him is a minor worker, and then you have the queen. The morphologies are all different. Darwin thought that if he were going to give an account of the characteristics of these organisms, he would do so by natural selection. But immediately he saw what the difficulty was. The worker ants and bees are neuters. They have no offspring. Natural selection, however, operates on organisms that have any distinctive beneficial traits to allow them to reach reproductive age and pass on those traits to offspring. These guys have no offspring. So how to explain it? Darwin was greatly puzzled by this. He thought it was going to be detrimental to the development of his whole theory because he knew that objectors to his view would latch upon something like that and show that something very fundamental could not be explained by his theory. It was also the case that if you were talking, say, for example, about soldier bees, one of their features is when they're protecting the hive and against, say, a marauding bear, they sting the bear, but they're eviscerated as a result of that. That is, they die. Therefore, the trait that allows them to defend the hive doesn't do them any good at all. So that couldn't be explained either. But they, too, are neuters. So there was a kind of double problem that Darwin had to solve. And in the throes of the composition of The Origin of Species, he, in fact, did solve it. And it was adumbrated by Wallace, namely that natural selection works on the whole hive or colony. So that, for example, in the case of a beehive, if we think back 90 million years, and that's approximately when bees began to evolve, those hives that by chance had more aggressive members, they would have a better chance in the whole hive surviving against predators than, say, other hives that had fewer such aggressive members. And over time, that hive then would survive. Queens would go out, daughter queens from the queen in the original hive. They would establish new colonies. Since they're all the same family, that trait of aggressiveness would be passed on to the workers. So what you would have is natural selection working on the whole hive. And perhaps you can see that this offered him a clue by way of trying to understand how morality might have evolved. And indeed, in The Descent of Man, Darwin uses the model of the social insects in order to explain this. So what he conceives is the following, that among our proto-human ancestors, they obviously lived in small tribes, small clans, which, being members of these small clans, they were probably all pretty much closely related to one another. And so those clans that by chance had more cooperative members, more sympathetic members, members who were willing to defend the tribe against ingressors, they would have a better chance of survival than tribes that lacked such members, so that over a period of time, these instincts of mutual aid, for instance, would begin to develop in these tribes. And as they prospered, the ones with more members like that, and established new groups, and their traits got passed on, that would be honed over a long period of time. Let me just read to you a passage from Darwin's Descent in which he sums up his view about the origins of morality. It must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over the other men of the same tribe, yet that an advancement in the standard of morality and an increase in the number of well-endowed men will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who, from possessing in a high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. At all times throughout the world, tribes have supplanted other tribes, and as morality is one element in their success, the standard of morality and the number of well-endowed men will thus everywhere tend to rise and increase. So he was proposing group selection, or what we would call kin selection, as the explanation for the evolution of moral traits. He also used that same idea to explain man's big brain, because those tribes that by chance had more creative members, where there existed a mute inglorious Newton, that tribe would, in existing in the particular environment it was in and in competition with other tribes, would have the advantage. And therefore, intellect would evolve as well over time by reason of group selection. He also thought that language would play a role. Namely, language would have a kind of, it would be like a reciprocating engine. That as individuals began to use language, the language would have a rebounding effect on brain, and the exercise of brain, like the exercise of your muscles, would redound to those who are more facile in speaking language, and there would be an inheritance of acquired characters. Darwin always believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, so he always had that at the ready. That was not simply the province of Lamarck, but that was also Darwin's idea as well. So he had two mechanisms to account for man's big brain, and he had this notion of group selection to account for human moral character. He also believed that along with these altruistic instincts that human beings would, over generations upon thousands of generations, hone, there would be cultural evolution as well. So it's not only the case that you want to benefit those in your tribe, you have to learn who are members of your tribe. And this is what Darwin thought cultural evolution would produce. It would allow individuals to recognize that racial differences are really superficial, that they don't go to what it is to be a human being. And so while you may shed your altruistic behaviors on members of your own tribe, soon after a long period, you would begin to see those individuals across the river were really no different than members of your own tribe, and you would start acting altruistically toward them as well. So there would be a continual development, both biological, of the moral instinct, and simultaneously, or a bit later, there would be a kind of cultural evolution. And cultural evolution would allow one to recognize that we're all pretty much the same. And Darwin had the great sort of hope that this foundation for morality, particularly cultural evolution, would continue to spread. Well, So I've taken you up to Darwin's account of evolution by natural selection, and perhaps you have some questions about whether his argument really works or not.
How do we reconcile the altruistic traits with the conflict between people of differences?
If you're trying to construct a theory of morality, it's not going to always give you an account. I mean, if your mother told you when you were growing up, treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, when there's a conflict, that actually doesn't help too much in resolving the conflict. What you have to sort of work out is, how would you like to be treated in a particular situation? And the way you would like to be treated may be not the way somebody else would like to be treated in that particular situation, and therefore you have to move back to a kind of common ground. But it's still the principle and the validity of the principle, Darwin thought, was the result of evolution by natural selection. What he found to be a little uncomfortable, or at least what he disliked, was the notion that people would be good or act according to duty because if they didn't, they'd be punished, either by the police hitting them on the head, or a Chicago cop, or the great policeman in the sky hitting you on the head after you die. So that seemed to him to be really not really a moral position at all. I mean, we don't think people are acting morally if they act only to avoid punishment. We think they act morally when they do it from a sense of what is right and from a sense of duty. And what Darwin tries to explain to you is that sense of duty is bred in the bone. It's part of virtually our biological endowment. It goes very deep. It's not something we have to learn. It's something that comes with us.
So you have a theory of morality that's based on natural selection, and you have a theory of morality based on religion, say. But couldn't those be tested by experiments, and haven't they been tested by experiments? And is there experimental evidence that would favor one of these theories over another?
Well, there is a kind of experimental evidence. It has to do with, and you know, experiments in anthropology are rather difficult, but here's some of the evidence, and it's mildly anecdotal, is that you find within Aboriginal groups, and in our groups too, well, I'll tell you what, let me give you, I'm now told to go back and start talking some more, but let me just give you an example, and you can mull over it, and then toward the end we'll come back to it. Here's the kind of example I have in mind. If you're walking down the street and you see a fire taking place in a building, and you look up and you see hanging out the window, crying for help, well, your son or daughter, would you run into the building to try to save them? And I think most people here would, without hesitation, even though the place is ablaze, try to save a son or daughter. Now, you're walking down the street, you look up, you see the blaze, hanging out the window is your cousin. What would you do under those circumstances? I think most here would make a great effort to try to help the cousin. If you saw it was a complete stranger, I'm sure you would be much more hesitant to run into a burning building in which your own life might be sacrificed, but you would wait for the rescue team to arrive. But I think this graded response is explicable in Darwinian terms. But most philosophical foundations for morality don't make distinctions, graded distinctions, about who it is that you have a duty to help. You have the same kind of duty to a complete stranger as you would a kin. There would be no reason to select one over the other. But Darwin measures, I think, gives you a kind of more realistic approach to morality. He explains how it arises, and he explains our own experience of morality in that respect, namely that we have this kind of graded response. But as a matter of fact, if you looked at Aboriginal societies, they might as Darwin quotes some instances of this, not burning buildings, but something comparable, they might be perfectly delighted if it were somebody, a tribe across the river that one of the members were hanging out the window crying for help. You know, they would perhaps blow raspberries at that person who needed help. So one can, this is not perfect evidence, of course, but it is, I think, mildly persuasive evidence. Amazingly, someone like Richard Dawkins, who no one would question his Darwinian credentials, but in his book, The Selfish Gene, says toward the end, we have to teach our children altruism because they won't get it through their biology. Now, it's obvious he never read The Descent of Man, good Darwinian though he is. If you have to learn morality, that means you're not naturally inclined in that direction. There is other kinds of evidence. The giving of these moral surveys to children, and you can chart the development, the moral development of children rather exactly from a moral response to certain scenarios that are set up. You know, would you take that cookie out of the cookie jar if your mother told you not to do it? So you ask a little kid that, and depending on their age, they're likely to say, well, if my mama's not around, yeah. Or then they were likely to, they might say, well, if my mother's around, I don't want to, you know, disobey her. And there's a kind of development, a moral development that you can chart in children and in adults as well. Some don't reach, as it were, the top of moral development. That is, they're not, I'm sure you've met people who seem to be retarded in that respect. But what this suggests is that, and Darwin was quite pleased with this moral theory, that it meant that human beings are not intrinsically selfish. It used to be thought that when you talked about Darwinian morality and applied natural selection to give an account of what we take to be moral behavior, that somehow this meant that human beings would act always selfishly and for oneself, even though there was a patina of altruism or a patina of acting for another or unselfishly. But deep down, this had to be a selfish view because that's the way natural selection works. It works on an individual that displays any trait that gives the individual a benefit, not the recipient of that behavior. But from the perspective that Darwin developed in The Descent of Man, and the one that Wallace suggested, that need not be the case insofar as one acted really considering the mechanism or the device of group selection. Let me turn back to Thomas Nagel. Nagel had the same worries as Wallace did. How could it be, he asked, that selection for fitness in the prehistoric past should have fixed capacities that are effective in theoretical pursuits that are unimaginable at the time, pursuits in science, logic, and ethics, all of which require very big brains and the application of norms? How could Stone Age man have acquired the brain power in excess of what was immediately necessary for survival, but useful only thousands of years in the future? That's the kind of objection that Nagel makes, and it's the kind of objection that Wallace initially proposed. How do you explain man's big brain? Well, the first response to Nagel and Wallace as well is a question that Huxley actually put to Wallace when Huxley was in his full Darwinian mode. How much brain power does it require to survive in the prehistoric environment? Should a 19th century gentleman or a 21st century philosopher be placed back in that primitive environment? How would they do? What requires greater intelligence? Trying to puzzle out the dangers of disease, potable water, avoiding predators, defending against marauding tribes, constructing stone tools, finding one's way in dense jungles, avoiding the enemy. Does that require as much brain power as perhaps a college student trying to solve certain puzzles in physics, the set puzzles they're given? Or to put it slightly differently, and I'll ask you, since my students sometimes ask me, who was smarter? Aristotle, and I come from the University of Chicago, and Aristotle has a special place in our hearts at the University of Chicago. Some of you will know that, others perhaps not. Who's smarter, Aristotle or a contemporary physics student? Contemporary physics student can solve really arcane problems in quantum physics that Aristotle couldn't even imagine. But who would you put your money on? Seems to be put your money on Aristotle. So the message here is that if you're living in a primitive environment and surviving, that takes an awful lot of brain power. So it's not as though there is an excessive brain power that native groups have. They probably needed every bit of it to survive in their particular environments. And that was useful later on for the kinds of pursuits that we follow out in contemporary civilization. So it wasn't the case that there was something in excess in a quite earlier period. And not only that, although Darwin tried to give an account, Darwin always thought that if one account is good, two are better. So he had multiple explanations for certain features of evolution. In the case of human evolution, he also thought that, as I mentioned, language would have a kind of rebounding effect on brain, such that, and from this notion of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, as you exercised the language ability, it would be like exercising your muscles, and that would be acquired and passed on to children. Now, we no longer believe that. And Darwin need not have employed that. Contemporary linguists and contemporary evolutionary theorists certainly recognize that in small social groups, the ability to communicate effectively is going to have survival consequences, especially in earlier tribal groups. So that learning a language and being able in that language is going to benefit those who have, a little by chance, a little more brain power, and there's going to be that kind of reciprocating development. Language develops simultaneously as brain develops. So there are many ways in which that kind of account can be given to explain man's big brain. Darwin was, I think, our predecessor. He didn't have answers to all the questions, and there's certainly quite important questions that he left unresolved. But I think that one can see just in this small way that he was an extraordinarily creative thinker. And especially when he put his mind to it, he was often perplexed by problems. And one of the wonderful things about studying Darwin is that Darwin, if you put him on a psychoanalytic couch, you would describe him as anal retentive, because he never let go of an idea that he once formulated, and he never let go a scrap of paper that he ever put pen to. So you can go to the Cambridge archives, and you find notebooks that he kept in grammar school. So you can actually follow the development of Darwin's ideas in really quite a bit of detail. And he was, without a doubt, an extraordinarily creative thinker. One of the things that gives, I think, me anyway, and I suspect all others who are more familiar with Darwin, some hope is that Darwin at Cambridge was a great disappointment to his father. First of all, at Edinburgh, he went to Edinburgh Medical School, and he virtually flunked out of Edinburgh, although actually what happened was he just couldn't stand it. It was an awful experience. Though his grandfather went to Edinburgh Medical School, his father went to Edinburgh Medical School, his older brother went to Edinburgh Medical School, Charlie went to Edinburgh Medical School, lasted 2 years, and came down. He said, and if you ever have opportunity to read his charming autobiography, he said, contemplating going to class at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning in Edinburgh is something fearful to remember. And it was that kind of experience, plus his inability to stand the kinds of surgeries that went on without anesthesia that he was witness to. He came down. Great disappointment to his father. Got the chance to set out on the Beagle. But the kind of intelligence he had was one that someone who appreciates evolution by natural selection would think quite appropriate. He didn't have that incisive, razor-like intelligence. When he was in the presence of Thomas Henry Huxley, he said he was always a bit uncomfortable because Huxley had that rapier-like wit. He was funny, he was incisive, he always had the bon mot. Charles never had that, really had that ability. But as we all recognize, we have Darwin's theory, we don't have Huxley's theory. Darwin would, in his working out of the problems of the kind that I mentioned, for example, with the social insects, he would try this, he would try that, he would try this other solution. Frequently they would fail. He would come back, he would try something else. But that's actually as if it were natural selection at work. These are variations that are thrown out. And then you can see in the notebooks, all of a sudden something clicks. It's not the answer quite, but it looks like it might be on the way to the answer. So there are variations on that particular approach. And finally, amazingly, he comes up with the answer that he's looking for. Patricia offered you a brief exposure to the origin of species, I presume. At least I heard the echoes of that. I was walking in the room. It's a wonderful book, and there are many delights in it. And it's one of the peculiar features of Darwin's accomplishment that it's probably, evolutionary theory is the only major, huge theory that is used to explain so much of biological life and psychological life that bears the name of its originator, Darwinian theory. Virtually no other theory in physics or psychology or anything else like that has carried the stamp of the individual who created it. This gives you an indication, I think, of Darwin's extraordinary genius. And it's a genius that is realized in his account of intelligence and morality. Thanks very much.